All right, so hi everyone again. My name is Andreas Pflugrad. I'm a software engineer and business architect for eXXcellent Solutions in Germany. And in this talk, I'd like to show you how we use UI5 components in a couple of different ways in supporting our application development in sort of a micro-frontend-like manner. So that's me. And after a short introduction to the topic, I'll briefly show you, the standard way of component integration, and then two ways that I don't consider standard and that might come in handy whenever you should face such situations as we did. So a large part of my daily work is developing freestyle UI5 applications of varying size and complexity for our customers. And especially for the more complex ones, the big single-page applications, we want to structure their different parts in a way that allows us to fulfill all the application's requirements, of course, but also to develop them in an efficient way, so avoiding having to develop the same or similar parts multiple times and reusing parts whenever applicable. And in order to do this, we need to have fairly independent parts that can be developed mostly on their own, meaning that they don't have too many cross connections to other functional parts. And this, to some extent, ties into the concept of micro-frontends. The whole concept certainly goes beyond what I'm showing today, but the important bit of this idea is, to me, is this idea of having independent, smaller parts of front-end functionality, maybe smaller front-end applications that are then brought together to form a bigger front-end application, where the smaller modules themselves handle all the actual application content, while the overarching full application is just a kind of an orchestrating layer. And so each of these smaller applications contain their own data service connections and their own logic, everything they need to basically exist and be maintained on their own. And that sounds a lot like UI5 components. These also allow us to develop encapsulated parts of functionality that take care of their own data, their UI definitions, logic, and can, in theory, be used standalone as well as being part of a bigger application. And the neat part about this is the wide range of how extensive or not such a component can be, both visually and functionally. So we can develop components that are as small as being a single button with a bit of data fetching, maybe some logic, but we can also comprise entire standalone applications. So this is giving us an enormous flexibility for our development. And you can imagine I'm quite excited whenever I notice new developments in this area, whenever something new about component usages is being published. I'll be like, yeah, let's try that. Let's try to utilize that in our next project. Now, we did again have the opportunity to do so in a rather big project. And I will demonstrate some approaches we took, as well as some interesting difficulties that came with it, of just doing that, reusing these UI5 components in various ways. So let's start with what I consider to be the obvious standard use case, and then expand from there. So many of the components we build are custom, mostly standalone list detail applications that are embedded in some kind of application or application frame or freestyle launchpad. I'll probably refer to that as application frame from here on. And these components can be quite extensive. So they can handle a lot of data. They can have some complex filters, search, sorting, anything like that. And the component I'm talking about now has also some very extensive editing forms and some complex validation logic. So despite what I'm going to show soon, I will show a very simple component to just demonstrate what I mean. But let's imagine that this is a very, the real world counterpart to this is a very development effort intensive component that, you don't just develop in a week. It takes quite a bit of effort to change stuff from there. Okay, so these components are, as I said, embedded in this kind of application frame. And to do so, technically, I guess you all know that, we can register a component usage and make it accessible via routing as a component target. And we can then access it from pretty much anywhere within the application. And we're going to access that component from a link in the application frame's header. And then the component will be loaded into the navigation control, and we can interact with it. So far, so good. Now let's actually look at this small demo that I've prepared, and that will showcase what it could look like. So we are in the browser, we have our small application here. This application frame is featuring a header and a kind of a dashboard with a card here, just a static card to give it some life. And we have here our basic component integration. That's our component blue. The blue will make sense in a bit. And we can click on it and navigate to this component. The component is now loaded. We can see this is a proper navigation. The browser URL has changed. And this is a basic sample of a list detail component. So we have a list of blue data, and we can show details of the single data items. And as I said, it's just a very simple example. We can enter some remarks. We have some very, very basic validation to it. And these data items can be in a state of being approved or not being approved. So that's the navigation to the component. One thing that's starting to get a bit special here is we can simulate a dirty state. We can communicate this dirty state to the outside application frame. And now that we've done that, we can the application frame will not just navigate away without confirmation. We'll get a confirmation prompt to do so. So that's the basic premise of a component that's integrated in this kind of a frame. And yeah, I don't think I will surprise anyone with this. That's pretty much the standard case. Right, let's summarize this. Let's go back to the presentation. So in summary, we have our application frame. We can access the component from the header menu, and the component can report some state changes back. Technically, that's done by declaring an event. So the application frame can react to that. That's the dirty state simulation. Right. The next scenario might hold a bit of a surprise. Well, let's see. Now, one of the requirements we had in our recent application, which eventually inspired this talk, it came down to having essentially the same extensive and rather complex functionality. So just the same functionality that I just showed in the sample component, and it was to only have a very slight variation in the kind of data that was to be managed, and maybe a couple of different labels. But basically, we had to use all of that again. But as I said, with a bit of different data. So both these functionalities had to be accessible from this main header. So we have component A, that's the blue data component that I just shown, and we were to have another accessible component here, which is, as I said, pretty much the same, but it should manage what I originally called red data. So same component, one is managing blue data, one is managing red data, but the data structure is the same, and all the complexity in the component that I'm not showing here is the same. So developing a new component here was completely out of the question, and we had to reuse as much of this component as possible. And so we said, okay, let's just reuse the entire component and not do anything new. So what we did was we just introduced a bit of a configuration, a central configuration that we would place in a component. And with that configuration, we could, for each usage, decide, okay, which mode should this component be operating in? Should it be operating in blue data mode or in red data mode? And everything else would stay the same. And there are various ways of doing that, transferring that information of which mode to use to the component. And we've decided on the very straightforward way of just using component data to do this. So let's get into the code and see how this can look. You should see the browser now. We have here our standard component usage. So that's the data component that you've just seen with the blue data. And we just introduce a second component usage of the same component, and we just pass a mode parameter with the component data in the manifest. That's the manifest of the application frame. And we just pass the value red here into the component. So that's all the application frame needs to do, besides actually loading this component usage. I'll do that in a bit. Let's look into the component itself. How do we use it? Here in the sample, it's a very simple way. We just read the component data, and we read the mode parameter that we just gave, and put it in a model, in a component-wide model. So now at this point, we have this mode available anywhere within the component. We can use it in the controllers. We can use it in our views with an expression binding, for example. And now we can implement all the little differences that we need for our components to have an actual different operating mode. And here in the sample, I just do it in one single place in the controller of the list we've seen. We use this mode just to bind a different array from the data we load. This is just loading a bit of JSON data. We have a blue array and a red array, and depending on the mode, we just load the different array. So let's actually enable the red component in our application header. And if we load it again, we see we now have the second link, component red and component blue. And if we can click on it, we have the other root. Of course, I also had another root and another component target. And we see it has the exact same functionality without doing pretty much anything else. So that's a very simple way of getting a second fully functional component in there with just a bit of a variance. And unless we do a bit more, we can get an interesting problem here, and I can demonstrate that. I said we have a bit of a validation here. Let's trigger this here. Okay, we get a validation error. And without doing anything else, I will now switch to the blue component. Select any data item, and we see we still have the validation error here, and it's coming still from the red component. I can't click on it. I'm not getting there. I can trigger another one here, and I get a second one. I can get rid of this, but not of the other one. And in the wild, this was quite annoying to track down. Here in the sample, it looks quite trivial. The problem is both component instances now share the same message model or the same message manager, namely that of the UI5 core. So the solution to it is quite trivial. Don't share the message manager. Let's get into the component, and we will use a separate message manager instance for each component. And so we avoid any message conflicts here. Let's trigger one again here. Okay, let's switch to the red component, and there's no validation error here. So pretty simple way of getting these two operating modes to run. And there are, well, two things to take away from it. Well, one, you can get very efficient in doing this if you have this kind of scenario, very lots of functional overlap with some slight differences that you need to implement. Okay, and the second thing to take away from this, if you do it, don't share the message manager. Right. We had some more requirements in this real-world example, and you've seen the dashboard of this application frame. We want to populate that a bit further. So our requirement was that some aspects of the data that we manage with this one component should also be shown in an abbreviated way on the dashboard, and another similar part of that data should also be shown in the application header. So for this sample, let's assume that the approval status of the data items matters. And on the dashboard, we want to see a small list of items that still require approval. And in the header, we want to see the number of these items, the total number of items that still require approval. And once again, we want to have this created all by this one component. We don't want any other component. For this, it should all be done with the one we have. So let's do this. And we now need to create an additional way next to the regular navigation of actually getting the content out of there. So technically what we do, we pass a different parameter, all again via component data, and the component itself will then take care of providing an entirely different scope and a different visualization of its data. So let's head back into the code. What we're doing here, let's go back into the manifest of our application frame. We define two new component usages. Again, it's just the same component. And we now define a parameter called embed, or whatever you like. And we just pass the kind of output format that we expect from the component. And then within the component, we can evaluate that and create the different output. So let's look into the components, how this is done. Of course, now we don't want the standard view. We want to have a customized view for our embedded usage. And for that, we use the create content method, where now we evaluate the component data here, the embed parameter. And depending on what we passed, we will return a different view. And these views now will take care of the different visualization. That's the special embedded use. And in case of the standard use, we'll just return the standard create content method. One thing to note here is we need to move the router initialization to here, to the standard use, because none of these views will have the expected routing control. So that will avoid a runtime error we might have here. And these new views, required approvals button and required approvals card, they're fairly straightforward. The button is just a button with a badge that will show us this number, and the card is just an SAP F card with a bit of a list included, and will show us that data list. And the controllers will take care of loading the data. That's all, as I said, within that component. Let's see how this looks. I will need to actually enable the fragment here. So there's a little fragment in the header. It's just a component container that's going to use this usage of the button. And here on the dashboard view, I will activate a little fragment that's also just a component container for the other usage. So let's get back into the application. And we now see, okay, we have two new instances of our component, one with the required approvals, one with this little header button. And we can use it to jump into the component. We can approve it. And you see the number is already going down. We can do it again. Approve that one. And yeah, this will all be updated accordingly. So what we're seeing here now are 4 instances of the same component. We don't have to develop too much anywhere out of this. And given the right circumstances, this can be incredibly efficient. So one thing to note maybe here, of course, we now want to, we may want to share a bit of the status across all these components. So now we may want to use the global event bus to update these states. That requires a bit of additional implementing, but all in all, it's quite very efficient. Well, a colleague of mine, Paul, he came to me and asked, Andreas, is it worth it? All that hassle trying to get the separate instances to work together, avoid these conflicts, all the configuration, is it really worth it? And what I can say now with certainty is it depends. So if you have this scenario, if you have so much functional overlap and just some slight variations, yes, I think it's worth it. It has its merits. It can be incredibly efficient. And well, I will stay very interested in this topic and try out new things. So that's pretty much it. I hope you got something interesting to take away from this. If you'd like to have a closer look at the code, the sample application is there on our GitHub. The code will also be included in the conference webpage. And now I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. I wish you all a great UI5con and of course, happy developing.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. That was perfectly on time. Do you have any questions in the audience? Ah, over there. Someone wants to catch it.
So does flexibility still work? So adapt UI?
Honestly, I haven't tried it. I pretty much tried it so far with a freestyle application, and yeah, I haven't tried it yet. If flexibility still works, I'm sure there's a way to get it to work, but I couldn't tell you right now.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent question. All right. Any other questions? No one wants to catch the catch box? Oh, all right then. Can you pass it back to him so we don't lose it? Thanks. There is one question online. Is this component loaded through component container? I'm not sure what this component refers to. So I'd ask generally, are those containers loaded via the component container?
Yes, they are. I just used the component containers to load them. So you'll see in the sample code that there are just some fragments, and there will be just component containers, and we will. I'm not creating the components on the fly. I will just declare them as component usages in the manifest and let the framework take care of loading the component.
All right, great. Then, thanks very much again.